This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host, and I'm joined by Dr. Richard Blackaby.
Good to be with you as always, Sam.
It's always a pleasure, Richard. And we've done a little mini-series here on our great founding fathers of this great country of ours. And a lot of it just sort of came out of a recent trip you had to the sort of the homeland of many of these great leaders. And we've sort of dove in on a few of their lives and just how complicated sometimes it can be to lead, especially when you're leading something new, like founding a country and a democracy, and it's imperfect, it's muddy, it's cantankerous at times, but through it all, their legacy is intact, and it is a lasting legacy that they leave. But one aspect of leading that we're going to focus on today in this series on our founding fathers is that of empathy.
Yeah, and when you're starting up a whole country, you're fighting a war, you're asking people to put their life on the line, you get some really raw moments where you can show what leadership does. It's a leadership laboratory, and so that's why I think, just as I was spending a bit of time in Virginia looking at some of what the founding fathers, the early presidents did, there's just so many leadership lessons and observations. They don't always get it right, but they certainly show you some of the challenges that come with leading. And so I thought maybe in this last session that we would just talk a bit about empathy. And it was Daniel Goleman that really popularized the whole idea of emotional intelligence and said that was just a key to successful leadership. And that some of his theories have been challenged a bit of late, but I think there is something to, I think just the essence of that, which emotional intelligence comes down to empathy. It is the ability to intuit or to sense what's going on in someone else. A lot of people know what's going on in them. They know if they're getting angry or fearful or whatever, but it takes a certain skill to be able to sense the emotions going on in an audience and to your followers. I think a very similar thing happens when it comes to good teachers as well. A good teacher in a classroom can tell if they're losing their students, if they're getting bored, they're getting restless. I think a good public speaker, what makes them, I think, in part so good is not just their ability to speak, but their ability to read an audience. And I think that's probably why someone like Abraham Lincoln was so good. He was a common man, common upbringing, but he had a real sense of the pulse of the average person. And so he knew how to tell stories that spoke to those kind of people. And he had the kind of sense of humor that the average person would respond to and find funny. And so
I guess one question that comes up, in my mind as we think about empathy, is this something that can be learned?
Yeah, I guess you're jumping right in there into you're anticipating that. Yeah, and I've said this before, but I think you can learn. I think I can teach a person leadership. There are some skills that come with leading, whether it's delegating, equipping, holding people accountable, teaching, inspiring. There's certain things you can do that will help you as a leader. But the one caveat that I typically will list is if you have people skills. If you don't have people skills, you won't know which button to push. You won't know where to aim. You won't know what to do. You'll be doing one thing and you won't even realize that you're losing your entire leadership team. They're all bailing out. And so you won't know that you should be doing something else. And so I would say you have to, and that part, Daniel Goleman said that you could teach empathy, but it certainly is going to be very difficult. And there have been those that I think just I was kind of skeptical that you could, because now if you're smart, if you really want to learn, if you're really paying attention, But even then, I think you can only learn it to a certain degree. Let's say you didn't have any empathy, and yet you're trying to maybe be a school teacher, and yet you're not picking up the signs that your students are getting restless, they're bored, they're losing interest. You keep droning on, and so I might be able to show you video afterward and say, okay, Sam, do you notice here when people all start yawning? You see when they start flipping through their notebooks or leaning back or closing their eyes or laying their head on their desk? Those are all signs that you weren't picking up that. And so the next time you see 5 people in your room yawn, just make a mental note. Okay, I need to change the pace here. I need to get some energy in the room. And so you might still not, like a good speaker, a good teacher just can feel it in the air. They can just feel like, okay, I got to talk a little louder. I got to move around. I got to change up the focus. I got to engage the class. Got to do something. I can just feel like we're dragging here. You may never, if you don't have empathy, you might never feel that, but you might, because I taught you to count how many yawns you noticed or something, you would think, well, okay, I thought this was all going fine as far as I could tell, but based on the math, I guess I should change it up now. So whereas someone else wouldn't have to count the yawns, they would just,
there's an intuition. Yeah.
You can feel it in the room that I need to change things up. Whereas someone else maybe never feels it, but they've just been taught, watch for certain signs. And if you have these signs, then do this. But so I think with leadership, it's kind of a similar thing. I think there's people that really want to lead. Maybe they're in a position of leadership, but they don't feel it. They don't know how to connect with people at an emotional level. And so unless you can connect with your followers at an emotional level, you can administer them, you can manage them, but you're never going to really inspire them. You're not going to move them to some of the heights you might have had you been able to connect with them to their heart.
And that's one distinction that you've made is you can manage people, you can administer people, but leaders actually move people. You would say onto God's agenda, but more broadly, if you can't move people, if you can't inspire them to take action, to move from where they are to where they should be, then that's, you're only doing the job of a manager,
right?
And not an actual leader,
right? And so I think it behooves anybody that's in a leadership role to enhance your empathy. And Winston Churchill one time had a famous quote. He just basically said, people who ride in carriages have their own particular point of view. And I think what he was saying is aristocrats, wealthy people, they're riding up in a carriage. They're not walking in the streets with everybody else. And so they're higher up. And so they're going to view the same life everybody else is viewing and experiencing, but from a different angle. And the interesting thing with a lot of leadership in the past was that oftentimes in the past you would be an aristocrat. You'd be a noble. If you're going to be put in charge of the king's army or in charge of a regiment or something, you probably came from the aristocratic class. You probably had money. You had your own horse. You didn't have to walk like the infantry. And it was just kind of assumed that the people leading were all aristocrats. They all had a certain point of view. They all had grown up in a similar kind of way with a certain amount of luxury and privilege and so on. But at the same time, those people had a real difficult time identifying with the person on the ground because they'd never been that person. They'd never had that life. They didn't have to necessarily go to the front of the line as an infantryman when the enemy was shooting at them from point blank range. And so you wanted to lead them, but you didn't necessarily know their language. You didn't know what they were afraid of. You didn't know how to inspire them. And there's a famous account early on with George Washington where he kind of, although he grew up basically fatherless and relatively poor as a child, because his father died when he was young. But he was kind of adopted by an aristocratic British family that lived in Virginia, the Fairfaxes. And so he always kind of saw himself as a bit of an aristocrat. And then, of course, he became a plantation owner. And so when he was asked to lead the Revolutionary Army, initially especially, he had a bunch of militia that, like farm boys, some of them as young as 15 years old, just signing up and having maybe a 3-month enlistment until they could go home to the farm. And they would come with very rudimentary kind of weapons. A lot of them, their shoes wore off. They're walking around bare feet. They had rags for clothes, and they'd never been shot at before, and certainly not by trained British regular soldiers. And so early on, some of these soldiers it was almost embarrassing to see them. And really throughout the entire Revolutionary War, right till Yorktown, the British, when they finally surrendered at Yorktown, they all wanted to surrender to the French because the French soldiers were all dressed in respectable uniforms and looked sharp like soldiers. And then you had these ragtag American militiamen that looked like a bunch of hick farm boys, just right off the baling wagon, and the British were embarrassed to have lost to the Americans. And so when Washington is suddenly leading these soldiers, in the early stages especially, he was really indignant about them. And in fact, at one point, when a bunch of the American soldiers were running for their lives, fleeing from the British, Washington got so frustrated, he cursed and basically just said, "Is this what I'm supposed to fight this war with this kind of material, this kind of soldier?
Yeah.
How can I have an army that was so ragtag and so amateurish and rudimentary?" And of course, there's a big debate that Machiavelli kind of introduces in his book, The Prince, and he says a ruler or a prince, he says, can be one of two things. They can either be loved or they can be feared. And he has a whole section on what would you rather be? Would you rather have all your people that you lead fear you, respect you, or would you rather they loved you? And oftentimes you can have both. If you want to be your employee's best friend, then they may love you and appreciate you at least as long as you keep doing stuff that they like. But they may also not treat you with respect. They may treat you as a colleague, a peer. And so Machiavelli said, hey, I mean, if you can have both, that's great. If they love and fear you, that's a great combination. But his point was, but if you can only have one, he said, far better to be feared than loved. Because he said, if they fear you, then of course you can always be nice to them anyway. And then they're just grateful and relieved and caught by surprise because they expected the worst, and then you end up being kind to them. But he said if they love you, then it's hard to sort of get that respect back once you've lost it. And so Washington very much kind of followed the Machiavellian model there, and he believed you needed to keep a certain distance between officers and their men. Not that you'd be totally aloof from them, but they should know you're an officer and they should respect you and you should dress the part. And so early on when Washington was enlisting all of his officers for the new Revolutionary Army, he said, I mean, one of the things he was looking for is young men from respectable families, basically American aristocrats that carried themselves well, that knew how to ride a horse well, that looked good in a uniform, that had a good use of language and communication skills and so on, that cared for themselves well in a respectable manner. And so Washington begins by trying to develop an army that kind of parallels the British. That's all he knows. That's his model. But interestingly, over the course of basically spends 6 years with these soldiers in the field. And the Army didn't fight very much, usually in the wintertime. There were a few exceptions, like in Trenton, where he kind of sneaks in around Christmas and New Year's and wins a couple of battles. But But for the most part, you sort of went into your winter quarters and waited till spring to start fighting again. So that would have been a perfect time for Washington just to kind of get in his carriage and go back to Mount Vernon and spend the winter with Martha at his own place. But there were years where he literally feared that there wouldn't be an army left by the time he got back, that he needed to stay on site just to try to help get food and money and clothing for these starving, often underfed soldiers. And so basically for 6 years, he's in the field with these guys. And over the course of 6 years, he sees these farm boys fighting heroically and sometimes going days without anything to eat and going through the wintertime with basically holes in their shoes or no shoes at all, or no jackets, or not enough heat to stay warm in their little cabins in the wintertime. And he watches them fighting fiercely against the best army in the world and going toe-to-toe with them. And Washington changes, and he begins to change his view of these farm boys. And he's always a little embarrassed at how ragtag they look compared to the British and French, but he begins to empathize with them. He begins to see that they're made of some stronger metal than he first thought. And he watches their courage. He watches them rise to the occasion. Of course, they don't all do that, but he learns to appreciate the ones who have made great sacrifices. And it kind of actually bothers him because there's a lot of American business people that are actually making lots of money on the war, and they're selling here's the American army starving to death, and these American farmers are selling all their food to the British army because the British pay better. And so Washington's watching that and saying, well, these farm boys are starving and freezing to death out of patriotism for their country, but that patriotism is not causing the business guys to sell at underpriced so that their own army has food to eat. And so he gets to really appreciate these guys, and he learns how to speak to their hearts, and he learns how to speak in a way that motivates them. And Washington's not a great speech giver, and it's interesting because Washington, he has tooth disease basically, and while he's still, just middle-aged, or he loses all of his teeth ultimately. He doesn't have a tooth in his head left at the end of his, while he's president of the United States. And so he has to get these very rudimentary dentures and he's very embarrassed about it. It's very, very secretive. Like even the way he even writes letters in code to his dentist because he doesn't want the letters to fall into enemy hands, which sometimes they do. The British will intercept them. And if they do, he doesn't want his enemies to know that he doesn't have any teeth. And so the interesting thing, if you watch some of the pictures, the portraits of Washington, especially later on, sometimes his mouth, you rarely see him smiling, or not smiling where his teeth are showing. And even his chin will sometimes kind of bulge out in places, and he's got this very painful, awkward, archaic kind of dentures that he's using because he doesn't have any teeth in his head. And so it also means he doesn't like to talk a lot, doesn't laugh a lot or smile a lot in public. And so he's not a big speech giver, and yet he learns how to speak soldiers' language, and he learns how to what speaks to their hearts. And there's a very famous incident near the end of the Revolutionary War where the soldiers are just so frustrated because they haven't been paid. They've gone months without being paid anything, and they're hungry. They've got rags for clothes, and they're talking. They meet, and they're very seriously talking about, we need to just march on Philadelphia and just take those politicians at gunpoint and make them pay us or something what they owe us. It's not unreasonable what they want, but and so Washington hears about it. He races to the meeting, steps up to the podium, pleads with them to be patient. But then he instead of just condemning them for being so seditious, he praises them for the noble sacrifices they've made, and he says history will tell their story for years and years to come, and basically says, don't ruin it all now. You've been you've risen to such heights, and then don't ruin it because you just lost patience with this fledgling government. But then in a masterful kind of thing, and I don't think he did this on purpose. It was just instinctive at this point. But he's going to read a letter right at the end, but he's basically his eyesight has declined drastically, and so he goes to read a letter and he realizes he can't read the small print anymore. And he started wearing glasses, and so, but he has never worn them when he's out riding about or with the soldiers have never seen him with glasses on. He's always been back in his office with his glasses on, writing letters and things. And so he says, "Pardon me," he says, and he reaches out, puts his glasses on, and he says, "I've grown old in your service." And he says, "Now I find myself also going blind." And that was so impactful when they realized, here's a guy who's not just sat back in the White House passing decrees and making us pay all the price. This man has aged in the 6 years and lost his eyesight and gotten gray hair and lost what teeth he had left. And many of the soldiers they just start weeping because they feel like, even in that kind of dignified sort of way, Washington has just spoken from the heart, and they identify with him, and they recognize, here's a man who's suffered with us and who knows what it means to be frustrated and to not have what was promised, and yet he's still being noble and he's still speaking to us person to person. And that inspired him. And so it wasn't natural for him. He was more naturally an aristocrat, but he realized, but if I've got to lead these people, I've got to look them in the eye and be able to talk to them in ways that they understand, in ways that move them. And that requires empathy. That requires knowing your audience and knowing what they actually care about.
Well, that brings up a couple questions, and I'll save those for after the break. This fall, we've got 2 opportunities to attend the Spiritual Leadership Coaching Workshop that Blackaby Ministries offers each year. Normally, we just have one in the fall in Jonesboro, but this year we have, in addition to the one in Jonesboro, we have one in Rapid City, South Dakota. And these are for folks who work with people. You might be thinking, well, I'm not interested in coaching. That's not really something I'm into. But I would say that anyone who deals with people can learn something from these coaching workshops. It's really learning about how to ask the right questions to help move people onto God's agenda. These coaching workshops will be October 23rd and 25th. That's going to be the one in Jonesboro, Georgia. And then October 12th and 14th will be the one in Rapid City, South Dakota. All the information about both of these can be found at blackabycoaching.org/workshop. There is a discount for early registration, and that goes through the month of August. And so if you would like to attend one of these, best to sign up sooner rather than later. So Richard, hearing you talk about how Washington kind of begins his journey with those soldiers and then sort of ends his journey being more empathetic, obviously he's gone on a bit of a character arc there. He's grown, he's matured, he's gotten better at his job. How much of this empathy thing and, knowing your audience kind of approach, it seems like a lot of that has to just do with time with the people you're leading, but then also how much is the circumstances in which you lead? Because I would think that a wartime leadership has a way of kind of compressing your ability to learn and react and adjust into a much faster sort of way. There's sort of a pressure cooker effect. Right. Maybe it took him 10 years to learn it otherwise, but since he's at war, he's got 6 months to figure it out or die.
And that's a lot of people have realized that, even when it comes to things like racism, you put black and white soldiers in a platoon that are being shot at by enemy, and they very quickly become a band of brothers, regardless of their ethnicity and their race. And a lot of times the same on a sports team, because you're together, you're living together, eating together, serving together. And
There's a common enemy.
Yeah, and so that will
things.
certainly drive you quicker to identify. And I think that's very true of Washington. I mean, it was a life and death with each other for about 6 years. So you had to appreciate people that were willing to put their life on the line for what you wanted, what you were asking them to do. And, there's certain ways you can do that. I mean, I think if you want to empathize more, you have to be able to get out of your own skin. And you have to realize not everybody's going to be motivated the way you are. Yeah, some people are highly disciplined people. They're very self-motivated. And they often have a real difficult time understanding people that aren't. And so it's like, well, and Washington often, he did struggle with that. And it's interesting because he kind of learned to identify with this ragtag group of soldiers. But as a slave owner, he definitely had his blind spots there. And there were times I read that he, over the course of his career, that Washington had about 47 slaves who escaped his plantation, that ran away. 47 over the course of the years that he was running it. And there were times where Washington was absolutely befuddled why anybody would run away from his plantation, and especially some of his favorites and one of Martha's favorites.
Yeah.
And they would say, but that was our favorite. She got to work inside with Martha, and he was trained to be a special cook, and we put a lot of effort into him, and we took him places, and we were very kind to him. And like, why would he run away? And you'd say, well, because he was still a slave, and he was not free, and he wanted to be free. And there was a certain point where I think the Washingtons never could really empathize. They just, of course, it was so foreign to them.
Right.
He understood what it meant to be a soldier, but he didn't know what it meant to be a slave. And so he could only go so far with that, where it's just clear that his empathy was not always
not
as
complete.
It should be.
Yeah.
But I would say if you're a leader, certainly asking questions, saying, well, but what is it like? And that's why, of course, there's been a lot of talk about walking the shop floor, just leading by walking around and just seeing what happens in the ranks. Sam Walton was famous for that. He would show up at midnight in the room where all the Walmart truckers would go eat. He'd bring a box of donuts or something and just sit down and just ask them what they were seeing and experiencing as truckers hauling all the Walmart goods in and out, and what concerns they had. And because of that, he, of course, developed a great transportation system and a whole system of moving products like the world had never seen before. But he didn't assume up in his ivory tower that he just knew everything. And of course, that's always a danger for people that lead. The higher up you go, the more out of touch you're in danger of becoming down below. And so certainly understanding psychology, understanding that people have various struggles, various perspectives. And as a leader, you can't expect that everybody will just see things the way you do, that they'll value what you do. Mm-hmm. Certainly, if you own the company, you can't be bewildered when people don't want to work as hard for the company as you do, that they don't want to sacrifice their families for the company like you might be doing. They have other priorities, and they have a right to have their own interests that they're meeting. They're not working there to make you successful. They're working because they need to earn a living. They want to pay off their mortgage. They want to get their child through college. And so understanding, well, what is it that these people need? How would they feel successful? How would they be excited and happy about our business or our church doing better? I've seen that with pastors at times. They want their people to make all kinds of sacrifices so the church is more successful. But really, it's making the pastor more successful. Mm-hmm. And it's like, why can't you just sacrifice every evening here at the church so that I create a reputation for myself as a great pastor? Yeah. I think empathy means you look at people and you say, well, what is it that would cause them to be loyal? How if I were to treat them in what way that would make them proud to work here and grateful that they got to work here with us. And but I can't assume it's just they just love this company just like I do. They don't own it. They're not the CEO. They're not the pastor. But if I understand what makes people tick, if I understand what they're afraid of, if I understand what they're worried about, and then I can speak to that and I can fashion it. And most people don't want to just be a clog in the wheel, just like one more of many different little parts of the machine. They want to feel like they're a person of importance, of worth, that their contribution makes a difference. And that's what Washington would do. He would tell them, "You're making history. People 100 years from now will be inspired by your story of sacrifice and patriotism and loyalty." And he would say, "You're not just a grunt foot soldier. You are a patriot." And he used words that would speak to their hearts and their aspirations to be someone of significance. They weren't going to be the general. They weren't going to be elected president after being a foot soldier in the Revolutionary Army. But they could be someone that won a great victory for their nation and that their descendants could be proud of. And so he would speak to that and language that did connect with them. And so I think especially, I might just wrap this session up by just saying I think it's more necessary than ever to have empathy as a leader, because the workforce is more diverse than it's ever been. It used to be that most people working for you probably had a similar background and similar aspirations and similar ethnicity, maybe even similar gender. And now there's just a hodgepodge. The whole world is there in the workforce. Every imaginable ethnicity, background, religious background. And so for you to lead them, if you're oblivious to the different viewpoints that they have, various backgrounds they come from, various concerns they have, you're going to be constantly stepping on landmines and wondering, well, why are they so upset? That seemed pretty straightforward to me. Why are they all angry? Yeah. Why are people leaving? Why don't good people want to work for me? Well, it may be that you lack empathy. It's interesting. Even Hamilton, who admired Washington a great deal, but he was writing letters for Washington. He was doing administration for Washington. But what Hamilton really wanted to do is be on the battlefield. He wanted to make a difference. He didn't want the war to end without him having at least had a chance to win glory and honor and with bravery and so on. And Washington, but he just saw him as too valuable in writing letters and things to let him go out on the battlefield. And finally, Hamilton quits. It just says, "Washington, I'm glad to help you, and I know you need someone that can write your letters for you, but I'm a young man, and I want to be able to tell my kids that I fought out on the field, not just I wrote letters the whole war." And so he ultimately, Washington, sort of belatedly realizes, okay, this guy, he needs a chance to shine and be able to tell his grandkids that he actually fought in one of these battles. And so he puts him. He did lead some artillery early on. That's how Washington noticed him. But then for several years, he was just writing Washington's correspondence. And so he ends up leading an attack at Yorktown right at the very end. Hamilton gets to lead soldiers in battle, and of course it's a very big battle that ends the Revolutionary War. And even a hero of mine like the Duke of Wellington grew up without any praise. His parents didn't think much of him. And when they asked him later, what would you do differently? If you could lead over again, what would you do different than you did in your life? And he said, I would have given more praise. I would have spoken to people's hearts more. He said he wasn't used to getting it, so he didn't know how to give it. And so people respected him because he beat Napoleon. He was a good general. But he didn't know how to speak to people's hearts the way that his people needed him to. And he realized even belatedly, he probably could have been even a better leader had he known how to empathize with his men. And so I think for all of us, it's hard for everybody to get out of their skin, to realize people aren't just like them. But I think if you really want to be a great leader, you're going to have to say, how can I be more empathetic? Instead of just getting upset because people think differently than me, maybe I need to take time. I may not always agree with their perspective, but I need to do a better job of understanding their perspective.
Yeah.
And then perhaps I can lead them better than I am right now.
Well, that's our hope here, that you're always going to be leading better than you did before, and that's a great place to leave it.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.